We're going to start. All right.
Whatever you like, sir.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, if you are out in the hall, we are about to start.
Wait again.
Wait 1 minute. Okay. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to wonderful sunny Cleveland. I'm sorry about the rain, but at least it's not snowing, and we are very excited to have all of you here for our 41st annual Canada-U.S. Law Institute Conference. I am Michael Scharf, the co-dean of the law school, and it is my great pleasure to formally ring Henry King's bell, which is the traditional start of this conference. Henry King, if you didn't know, was the long-term director of this conference, and he was a former Nuremberg prosecutor, and his spirit is still with us. In fact, the conference bears his name. This is a really great time to be having this particular conference. And when the executive committee met last June, I think we had no idea how extraordinarily relevant this was going to be this very week. In fact, yesterday, as all of you know who've read the news, the Trump administration released their blueprint for the renegotiation of NAFTA. And we will be the first legal panel in the country addressing on live webcast for people around the world to watch the very issues that everybody has on their mind. This university is completely steeped in this issue. In fact, on Monday, Vincente Fox will be speaking across campus to our university. So this is the kickoff of something that the university is really embracing in terms of trying to get the word out and trying to have the academic and practitioner contributions to these important policies. My job today is to welcome you and also to thank our sponsors and the people who have made this conference and the organization possible. So on the sponsors, you notice when you were checking in, there is a big poster that lists them, but let me just tell you who they are, because without their support, we couldn't be here today. Our platinum sponsor is DLA Piper. Our gold sponsor is Dickinson Wright. Our silver sponsors include the Canada Consulate in Detroit. Left out of my intro yesterday was Baker Hostetler Law Firm. I should mention that this beautiful, newly renovated moot courtroom is thanks to their generosity as well. And that's Mr. Hostetler's picture back there. We also have, as a silver sponsor, ALT Technologies, GE Canada, Cliffs Natural Resources. For the bronze sponsors, we have Taft, Statinius, and Hollister, Wegman, Hessler, and Vandenberg, Air and Earth for Mica Group, Phillips Lytle, and Bennett Jones. And our program partner is the Cleveland Council on World Affairs. This organization is run by a group who takes no pay and spends a lot of time trying to help us fundraise, come up with the concepts, the panels, the speakers for these conferences, and they are really what makes this possible. Our co-chairs are Jim Blanchard and Jim Peterson. The presidents are the deans of Western Ontario and myself. There's a new dean at Western Ontario, Erica Chamberlain, who will be joining us next year. Then our executive committee includes Dick Cunningham and Larry Herman, who won the two prestigious awards last night, and we thank them for their long-term contributions. We also have Ross Hornby, Laura Dawson, Diane Francis, Ken Jones, Rick Newcomb, and Chris Sands. And then finally, we have two national directors, Kai Carmody from Western, Steve Petrus from Baker Hostetler on the U.S. side, and our managing director, who most of you have seen because he runs around and makes all of this work, is Ted Perrin. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to the first panel, and once again, I ring you in to the 41st Annual Conference of the Canada-U.S. Law Institute. Thank you all.
Okay. Thank you. Good morning. Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs. Nous sommes très heureux d'être ici aujourd'hui, but we'll do the rest in English.
Pourquoi?
If any of the panelists wish to answer questions in French, that's their choice. Okay. The U.S.-Canada relation, I'm Doug George, the Consul General of Canada in Detroit, and I have the distinct privilege of trying to corral this group of distinguished panelists today and keep us on track. Anyway, the Canada-U.S. relationship is a shining example of one of the most successful bilateral relationships in the world. We've got strong trading links. We are each other's biggest customer. We have a balanced and mutually beneficial trading relationship with about $2 billion a day in goods and services crossing the border. We have strong defense links. We jointly protect the North American continent through NORAD, and we fought side by side, including in 2 world wars, Korea, Afghanistan, and most recently in the fight against ISIS. We have strong environmental links here in Cleveland, especially on one of the Great Lakes. It's important to remember we have joint responsibility for protecting the Great Lakes, 20% of the world's fresh water. And the list goes on and on and on. Now, we've gone through some recent elections. In 2015, Canada changed governments and elected Justin Trudeau's Liberals. They've been governing for over 16 months. You may have noticed that last November, U.S. elected Donald Trump and Mike Pence, and the new administration has been governing for a little over 2 months. Now, Prime Minister Trudeau and President Trump held a very successful meeting in February and set an ambitious agenda through a joint statement. Canadian ministers have been meeting their counterparts as they've been confirmed, and they're developing good relationships to maintain these strong bonds. But if the first few weeks of the Trump administration are any indication, we are looking at, how do I put this diplomatically, a very active period in our bilateral relationship. So we have today a roundtable of distinguished panelists to discuss the way ahead. I will introduce them and then ask each of them to start with remarks of 3 to 5 minutes. Then we will get down to a Q&A session, and I think it'll be a very active and enlightening Q&A session. So there is a slight change from the program you have in front of you. Minister Christine St-Pierre was unable to attend due to press of parliamentary responsibilities, and we are very honored to have Ross Hornby, who is the former Canadian ambassador to the European Union and is currently Vice President, Government Affairs and Policy at GE Canada. Ross played a very important role in launching the Canada-EU trade agreement. Next, I'll introduce Ambassador Bruce Heyman. He literally needs no introduction if you were paying attention last night at dinner. He served as ambassador to Canada from April 14th to January 20th of this year. Something else happened that day. And he came to the post after a distinguished career at Goldman Sachs. He had the honor and privilege of having a front row seat during the grueling 11-week Canadian election campaign and the extended 2-week transition period from Prime Minister Harper's Conservative to Trudeau's Liberals. Next to him is the Honourable James Peterson, former Minister of International Trade for Canada. He served as a Member of Parliament and Secretary of State. He represented Canada in the Doha round, when at that time the approach to trade was focusing on the expansion of international trade. He's a legal scholar and teacher and is currently with Fasken Martineau. And Minister Peterson serves as one of the co-chairs of CUSLI. And last and certainly not least is Governor Blanchard, or I should say Ambassador Blanchard, 2-term governor of Michigan, member of Congress, and in 1993 was appointed ambassador to Canada. He, since we're in a law school, I need to mention this. He is currently listed as an international super lawyer and is with DLA Piper, and he is the co-chair of CUSLI.
Must be my mother wrote that.
Well, I will just do this in order. Ambassador Heyman, would you like to lead off with some short remarks?
So thank you very much, and thanks for the kind reception last night. So I thought this morning I'd chat a little bit about the work that the Trudeau government is doing and has done to get a jump start on the Trudeau government, on the Trump government, and give you a sense of what I saw firsthand, and then the manifestation of that and maybe the path ahead. So what took place immediately after the election is that excuse me, the Canadian government really reached out to business leaders, community leaders, consul generals, to their entire infrastructure and said, who knows Donald Trump? Who has a connection and where is that connection? In addition to that, Katie Telford had previously met Ivanka at a conference. And so everybody was triangulating, whether using, and it was not just one party, it was across party lines, which was, I think, fascinating to watch the coming together of the conservatives, the liberals, and the NDP all agreeing that they needed to focus on the U.S. relationship going forward. There were meetings taking place while I was still ambassador where members of the Prime Minister's staff were flying into New York, going to Trump Tower, having a series of meetings, and that enabled them to tell the Canadian story before the story was either developed on their own or having somebody else tell the story for them. All of those paid off in that first visit. And so it was a combination of having the women's conference that took place midday, which was something that was really created by Katie Telford and her work with Ivanka, and bringing that together. But I think it differentiated all the other meetings that the president was having and made for a very successful day. And I think the path ahead is as good as can be expected. And I will tell you from the people that I still communicate with in Washington, even on both sides of the aisle, I don't think that there's a country that is now closer to the West Wing than Canada. And I think the depths of those relationships have continued to grow, from Dina Powell to Ivanka to Steve Bannon to others. So hopefully this will pay dividends as we talk about the path ahead and the relationships that are going to be necessary as we dive into trade and border and other complex issues that will take place. But the other point that needs to be made is because the State Department, and you're seeing many articles even this morning, the State Department is not taking the lead in terms of international relations on a global basis. Very quiet, actually, and not a lot of staff have been filled in. This is really emanating then, the international policy is emanating from the West Wing. And so as a result of that and Canada's direct relationship, this is, I think, the best position Canada can be in going into what I would call this next phase, however long it lasts, of interactions. And I would also say there are probably more ministerial and cabinet level exchanges and visits that have taken place between Canada and the U.S. already so far than any other country. So on a positive note, this is good work on Canada, and I think that you have to have kudos for the Trudeau government in terms of its leadership in making that happen. So with that, I'm going to pass it down the line.
The Canadian story that Bruce referred to, just to remind you, involved two components. One was defensive and the other was offensive. The defensive was that Canada was not the problem in terms of U.S. trade deficits. They were running a $300 billion deficit with China, a $50 billion deficit with Mexico, and a $35.4 billion surplus with Canada when you include services. On the offensive side, the message was that there are 35 states that have Canada as their biggest market, and 9 million U.S. jobs depend on this healthy trade relationship. Having said that, I think that there's a lot of uncertainty out there right now, and the USTR notice to Congress about opening up and so-called tweaking the NAFTA certainly has a panoply of areas which I think are fraught with difficulty. One of their points is to expand access for U.S. agricultural products in both countries. This brings up the perennial issue in Canada of supply management. let me just say this. The U.S. is running about $25 billion U.S. of subsidies to agriculture. The EU is running over 65 billion U.S. dollars in subsidies, and Canada has very low subsidies compared to that. Now, my point has always been that, yes, we would be happy to put supply management of dairy, fowl, chicken, and eggs on the table. But we want to see these obscene levels of subsidies to farmers reduced in our chief trading partners first. We'll play, but only if they're prepared to be reasonable. Again, what was brought up here, and cut me off, Doug, if I'm going on too long, because we've got lots of time. In terms of services, they want increased access to our markets. They've said that. And they've mentioned telecom, and they've mentioned financial services. Now, we have controls on our big banks where no one party can actually control them. Telecom is very restricted. So they're gunning at that. They're also gunning for express delivery, and I suppose that's the post office, and the professional services in general. New and upgrading this agreement in line with what the U.S. had agreed to on the TPP prior to the Trump administration. They've included digital trade. They've included state-owned enterprises and state-controlled enterprises. And as far as Canada is concerned, I guess this will include crown corporations, and it will also probably look at sub-federal jurisdictions, the provinces, and the crown corporations that they might have. And I'm not sure which ones they're going to be gunning at, but I think we have to be ready for that. And again, as was signaled by the Secretary, the anti-dump and countervail regimes are going to be greatly enhanced in terms of enforcement, and what I think is going to be on the table in terms of rules of origin could be the autos. Right now, as you know, there's 62.5% has to be within the NAFTA group. Is the U.S. going to go for specific rules of origin for the United States alone, or will it be block wide? What changes are going to be made in that? And I know that our chairman has been working very closely with the government on this, and that some of the proposed border tax could increase the value of automobiles by about $2,000 if it goes through. And these rules of origin, how are they going to work where some of the parts have to come from offshore, even from outside the NAFTA, because they're not produced here? Canada is very vulnerable in Mexico in terms of their auto sectors. And just to conclude, Canada has gone from an historical high of 20% of U.S. auto production in the region to about 14% today. Mexico has now surpassed us and is at 18%. So I'll leave it for there.
Thank you, Governor.
Thank you, Jim. Again, Ambassador Heyman, we thought your address last night was as good as we've ever heard. And we really, it was very helpful and enlightening. I'm going to move back up to 30,000-foot level on our relationship. When we dreamed up the title of the conference, State of Our Nations, that was, last spring or summer, we had no idea that things would turn out the way they have with the U.S. election. Not that I thought that, and I was a Hillary supporter, that she would win. I thought it would be a very tough race. I didn't expect Donald Trump to be the Republican nominee, but I thought it would be tough because if you think back, the underlying climate in the U.S. was for change. When you've had the same party in power for 8 years and people keep reading about gridlock, there is a great movement for change, and that happened. I had no idea that millions of Americans would view Donald Trump as the lesser of evils. I had no idea that all the bashing and criticism of Hillary over the years would actually be accepted by a high percentage of our population, having known Hillary. But I want to digress a moment because, so that's, like, we could talk about the election in the Q&A. In addition to being described as an international super lawyer, I've always thought of myself as the international man of mystery, kind of like Austin Powers, my hero, a Canadian Mike Myers. But anyway, and I happen to be on the vice chairman of the National Archives in the United States. And they always, the archivist always comes up with interesting documents. So I want to read one to you. You will enjoy this. December 21st, 1987, a letter. Dear Donald, I did not see the program, but the missus told me that you were great on the Donahue show. As you can imagine, she's an expert on politics, and she predicts that whenever you decide to run for office, you will be a winner. With warm regards, Richard Nixon. This is true. So we have Nixon to blame for what's going on here. And what's going on now in Washington actually has the air of the kind of the Watergate era. It's really interesting. And so I played a game the other day at my favorite restaurant where a lot of political people hang out, Republicans as well as Democrats. And I asked them all, I said, let's assume the United States of America has the parliamentary system like Canada or everywhere else. How long do you give the president? And the average answer was about 2 years, which is pretty sobering for about 2 months into an administration. I don't know what to make of it. All I know is that what Ambassador Heyman said is true, which is if any country has reason to feel good about the relationship right now, it is certainly not Mexico or Australia or Germany, or it is Canada. The preparation that you mentioned, Ambassador, was obviously paid off. I read the statement that Prime Minister Trudeau and President Trump issued. It is very positive. It is very good. There is no dark narrative, which is what you normally get from the people who are writing, including the inaugural address from Mr. Trump. And it mentions one of our favorite projects, or should I say projects, the Gordie Howe Bridge, support for the Gordie Howe Bridge, which of course is the most important infrastructure project between our two countries by far. It alludes to autos. And by the way, it's really interesting. In June, Donald Trump went to a lower income white rural area outside of Lansing, Michigan, and had like 15,000 people show up at a rally and said, manufacturing is a disaster in Michigan, and no industry has been hurt more by the policies of Hillary Clinton than the auto sector. And that same week, record auto sales were announced in the United States, including in Michigan, 17.5 million cars sold, vehicles, which is unusual. And Canada benefits from that. Whatever the share is, a lot of it benefits Canada in an enormous way. So I was glad that manufacturing was mentioned in the statement, the Trump-Trudeau statement. But it does give you an idea that we're having a problem with people feeding information to the president that creates a false narrative about the world, whether it's that NATO doesn't work, or all blacks are living in ghettos, when, and by the way, in the Detroit area, majority of African Americans live in the suburbs and are doing quite well. That's not to say everybody, but these false narratives are very harmful to our relations with the world. Obviously, we're going to look to Canada to help manage our relations around the world. As many of you have figured out, you Canadians, however you feel about Justin Trudeau, he is the leading superstar politically in our hemisphere, not just in North America. He is. And Europe looks to him, too, for leadership, even though everyone recognizes he's still quite young and quite new. But I was pleased with the visit. We can, again, talk about the election. I will tell you this, that my Republican friends, they were shocked that Donald Trump won, even though they realized that he lost the popular vote. By the way, I introduced a constitutional amendment years ago as a member of Congress to establish the popular vote as a way to elect a president. So I felt, again, somewhat vindicated here, but anyway, a little late. My rule sheet, Hillary's president. But anyway, the interesting thing is that the Republicans were shocked that Trump won, and then quite happy that Hillary didn't win. And I must tell you, most important thing I can tell my Canadian friends, and Americans who are not in Washington, is they are very relieved that Mike Pence is vice president. Even if he's quite conservative, they view him as a kind of a regular orthodox government official, politician who believes in our three branches and our rule of law and our Constitution. So that is something you need to know. But I'll conclude and defer to Ross by simply saying that Canada has created the right narrative with Donald Trump, and all of us are going to have to work very hard to maintain that narrative, that this is one of the most, if not the most positive relationship, the most important partnership, and a partnership that works extremely well. And we should not fool around with it. We can tweak NAFTA. I say tweak. I don't care what the letter says, Larry Herman. We can tweak NAFTA. I would prefer if we do that not be an agreement put before the Congress, but be some sort of executive memorandum between our countries, because I think we do not want to have a gigantic debate over trade in the U.S. Congress. I don't see any trade deal being approved at all, given the narrative that somehow trade has hurt the U.S. far more than it ever has. I might also mention on NAFTA, there's the narrative that NAFTA caused all those auto plants in Michigan to close. Perhaps a couple because they make the small fuel-efficient cars in Mexico. That's true because the profit margin is very, very thin. But I became governor of Michigan in January 1st, 1983. Michigan's unemployment rate was 17%. Most of the auto plants had already closed, including in Flint, Michigan, which was the center of the distress. Michael Moore had a movie called Roger and Me about how General Motors made all these decisions and closed plants and moved plants, and it was true. We were hollowed out, but that movie was in the theaters in January 1989. 1989. That movie, right? NAFTA didn't become effective in January 1, 1994, 5 years later. So we can talk about what NAFTA's done, but I hate to see the false narrative that caused all that distress that was there 5 years before NAFTA. So that's just a historical fact. Anyway, I'm optimistic about how Canada's going to work with our new administration, and I think our Secretary of Defense, Mattis, is very, very good. Our Secretary of State has the potential of being very good, but lately has been left on the sidelines. So there are some appointees for President Trump that are good. And if he listens to them instead of his tweets, we're going to do a lot better than we imagine.
Ross?
Okay, well, thank you. After that, not quite sure. I think what I'll try to do is maybe put a business perspective on what the state of play is right now. And, I think generally the business community has been more focused on tax reform than on NAFTA. And that could start to change. And as yesterday's notice gets people's attention, and we start thinking a little bit about what we would like to see in a renegotiated NAFTA. And I would say, just as the other speakers have indicated, that Canada, just because of its system and flexibility, had a bit of a head start in preparing for that. And already a chief negotiator has been appointed, a fellow named Steve Verhoyle, who I know very well because he was the chief negotiator for the Canada-EU Free Trade Agreement, the CETA. And I can't think of a better person to do this. And the government of Canada has already set up a number of consultative processes around NAFTA. I chair a working group of the Canadian manufacturers and exporters. We've met with a special task force that has been established in the Prime Minister's office to coordinate the Canadian response to NAFTA renegotiation. And a number of other business associations as well have met with that group. And we've also met with Steve Verhoyle, who is as I say, going to be the chief negotiator. But we're still in very early days. And as others have noted, there are very few assistant secretaries who have been appointed. We still don't have a USTR. So we don't quite know what the division of labor is going to be between commerce, which everybody suspects will play a bigger role in the trade negotiation than it has in the past. But once USTR is up and running, I think the jury is still out on that exact division of labor. And we've seen the negotiating objectives that the administration sent to Congress. They're very high level. They really cover everything. So I think there's still a possibility that there will be different scenarios that will work out in terms of NAFTA renegotiation. I think just the backdrop that to all of this is we're really living through a period of unprecedented protectionism globally. People are really feeling that globalization has not worked for them. There's a lot of false narrative out there, as the governor has indicated, and a lot of people believe that they're hurting because of trade. The reality is different, that when trade goes up, jobs go up, employment goes up, but that it's very difficult to get that story out there. And I think both governments and the business community are challenged to do a better job at telling the story about trade. In terms of the scenarios, I think there's basically three scenarios out there. One is that there'll be a quick and dirty negotiation. That doesn't really work for Canada because there'll be something on rules of origin, something on intellectual property. Agriculture could be part of that. And if it's a quick and dirty negotiation, it may not actually even end up being much of a negotiation. It will be more of the United States saying, take it or leave it. And I think Canada has to worry about that approach. And I think the business community has to be worried about that approach as well. What we would like to see more is a comprehensive modernization of NAFTA. And we could use CETA, the Canada agreement with the EU, and the TPP as a template for what we would like to see in the agreement. We'd like to have some rules around cross-border data flows. We would like to have greater labor mobility in support of trade and services. We would like to see improved coverage, improved liberalization of trade and services. There are issues that could be addressed at the border to make goods and people flow more freely. And we would like to see regulatory cooperation entrenched in the treaty as opposed to just being an agreement between the government of Canada at the Prime Minister's level and the President to almost give moral pressure on regulators to talk to each other and cooperate. We'd like to see that as a treaty obligation because there still are regulatory differences between Canada and the United States that impede trade in goods and services. The danger of a comprehensive negotiation is that it could break down. In particular, we're worried about Mexico and the looming Mexican elections and the political pressure that will put on Mexico and constrain their ability to make a deal. And if there is a breakdown, I think we have to start planning scenarios. So we all know that Canada and the United States have a free trade agreement that predates NAFTA. It's suspended because of NAFTA, but it could come back into force. And do we go back to a bilateral relationship and renegotiate that and modernize that FTA? That's an option that we're looking at. And so I just think that we're in a very unsettled time. We're in a wait-and-see mode. We are planning for those different scenarios, quick and dirty, comprehensive breakdown. And it's a pretty scary time. And business investment has already been frozen. There's a chill out there in terms of where are you going to locate a new plant, where are you going to make your investments. I think hopefully in the next 6 months, we'll get much greater clarity around those issues.
All right, thanks to the panelists for opening remarks. I think there's a bit of a contrast coming up between how Canadians perceive trade liberalization and how the U.S. If we go back to the 2015 Canadian election, the TPP was actually finalized in the final weeks of the election. Ruling Conservatives immediately came out and said they'd adopt it. The New Democratic Party said they'd reject it. And Trudeau said he'd like to read it first and then consult with Canadians, which basically took it off being a major political issue. After that, we have been working on finalizing CETA. Canadians, but probably not Americans, were riveted to their TV when our trade minister walked out because of the blockage by a part of Belgium. And then we're now at the point of it moving forward. But I think the real story comes when we get to the U.S. election, where I don't think any candidate really came out in favor of trade. And the voices one would expect to hear saying that trade liberalization is good, we just haven't heard. So my question to the panel is, do you think the era of trade liberalization is over? But more as a Canadian government trying to deal with an American government, are we going to be faced with the situation of that was raised that if it ever gets to Congress, nothing will pass? Or are we faced with finding some way to move forward? My question really is, how do we approach the question of trade liberalization, which I think many in this room would agree has been good for all countries, and how do we sell it to the public? And I think Ambassador Heyman's hot to go.
Hot to go. All right, so here's the path that I think that we're on that I think that needs to be adjusted. And in all my work over the last 3+ years, working on U.S.-Canada bilateral issues, opportunities, trade agreements, I would say the approach that we have taken has been, while we have different perspectives, has been rational. And all of you work in, or many of you work in the legal profession, and you assume that there's rationality in terms of how we're going to approach these things. In the discussion of, hey, if I'll open up my dairy if you deal with subsidies, or we're going to sit down and we're going to discuss the various aspects of this trade agreement versus this. I think we have to build an assumption that this is not going to be the behavior of this government in the United States. And I think you have to prepare for outcomes that may be very different in terms of what historic trade agreements and trade negotiations have taken place. If you don't look at Donald Trump's tweets, I think that's a mistake. And this morning, he was, or whether it was this morning or last night, he was coming at the Chinese pretty hard in the way he was talking about it. That's not how you set up a discussion and negotiation beforehand, but he's setting a pattern. And that pattern, you saw how they tried to manipulate and make demands on Congress. That didn't work so well, but that doesn't mean they're going to course correct. That's how they're operating. That's how they're telling the various departments how to act within the government. They're telling the media, this is the way we're going to do this. And I wouldn't be surprised if they come in and go for quick and dirty, but really dirty in that this is the way it's going to be. This is what we want. We're the big player here, and here are all the things that we need to remedy. And you're going to sit down and say, well, let's talk about it. Let's consult. Let's go to a population. Let's read the agreement. No. I'm afraid this rational approach and the long history of in which we have approached our bilateral working relationship that has been so, painful at times but successful, in which we have been able to culminate very successful agreements with each other. I'm afraid the behaviors of this government, which you have not felt directly but watched indirectly, may be coming to a theater near you. And it will, and I hope I'm wrong. And also in negotiation, these guys are getting, you look at each of these cabinet members that are going through their hearings, and you hear all the things that they're starting to list out as things that they're contemplating with regard to Canada. My guess is they're going to throw everything, including the kitchen sink, in at the very beginning, which is a negotiating strategy in and of itself. But when the population starts seeing this and this starts coming out, I think it's going to be disruptive in Canada when people start hearing how the U.S. is behaving in this regard. And I think that the Canadian government has to prepare for an abrupt, difficult ask, maybe a demand, not an ask, and throwing everything, including the kitchen sink in, and how you're going to respond to that. And if you think you can just fall back on the last, we'll just go back to that other free trade agreement, I'm not sure that that's the best of strategies. And so we all don't know, but we do see behavior over 70 days on how the U.S. government is acting in every other realm. We haven't started this trade. We're watching the language they're using for Mexico. We're watching the language. And I understand the president has said tweak when he talks about NAFTA. I don't take that at face value. Tweak.
Ross, in the CETA negotiations, it came down to one sub-region of Belgium holding it up. Any thoughts on how we worked there and how that might apply to working with our good friends?
The CETA agreement is going to enter into force provisionally. Everything but the investor-state dispute settlement, but all the tariff reduction and the liberalization on trade and services will enter into force provisionally, probably as early as June 1st or July 1st. So essentially, Wallonie, which tried to block the agreement, is sidelined until the state ratification process goes forward. I don't think there's any lessons to be learned on the process of ratification in the EU. When you can't take that and apply it to what's happening here. I think the lessons that we learned in negotiating with the EU was that the road to Brussels was not down the street in Brussels, but through the member states and through the business community. And we reached out and we created a coalition in favor of that agreement. And I think the Government of Canada learned those lessons and is really trying to reach out to the business community in the United States and create a coalition of interests in favor of a successful NAFTA renegotiation. And the road to Washington, in other words, goes through Michigan or Ohio, or in particular those states where the business community has a vested interest in good trading relations with Canada.
Yes, I think I see John Weeks here. I'm reminiscing back. John was a principal negotiator for Canada on NAFTA. I was working on the politics of it as ambassador, and I worked right with the White House and with David Weiss, who you may recall, and Mickey Cantor about how we did it. And I'm telling you, NAFTA barely passed in the United States by, I think, about 16 votes in the fall of 1993. If that were put before the Congress today, it would not pass. I'm telling you that. So again, because of some false narratives, clearly an agreement that's 23 years old can be modernized and updated. And I think you guys are going to, several of you are going to talk about this. And I think what's recorded will be important for the dialogue going forward. The thing to keep in mind is that the Trump, again, narrative on immigration and trade was pretty much the standard 100-year-old nativism that we've seen from time to time in the United States elections. Nativism, certainly quasi-racism, although perhaps to most people unintended, but nevertheless, it's nativism, and it was bashing of Mexico. It was never intended to criticize or attack or bash Canada. So that's the good news here. All that rhetoric was really directed south, and I have to assume some of it quite unfairly. But there is the belief that trade has cost jobs, even though, as I mentioned, we had record auto sales in Michigan this year. If NAFTA were that bad or the free trade agreement were that bad, we wouldn't be having those record sales at all, particularly when autos and manufacturing are completely integrated between our two countries. So I'm not optimistic about putting any trade agreement before Congress. So I hope all of you will explore what avenues there would be short of having to submit a bill to Congress for passage, because I'm not, and TPP never would have passed Congress. It wouldn't have, even with Hillary president. And my guess is she came out against it. My guess is she would have tried to find a way to modify it later, a year or two later, and do it, because we can't afford to alienate 11 of our closest allies in in Asia. We can't do that. For the U.S., this is a terrible thing to pull the plug on that agreement without figuring out an alternative to dealing with those countries, which we already trade with anyway. So I'm worried about the overall climate, and we're going to need your help. And when I say the lawyers here who are good trade lawyers on both sides of the border, and the Canadians for your understanding.
I would say look at the smoke signals coming out of New York State. And I think that what's happening right now is the New York State passing Buy America provisions in their budget, and then Kathleen Wynne coming out very specifically challenging, as well as the Quebec government. And you're watching this ratchet up. And while some of the strategy has been go through the states, we're going to use the states to go through help with our agreements at the federal level. The states may not be as big an ally for Canada as you may think, because of some of the competitive things that are going on. New York State is one of your biggest trading partners, while we have Michigan, probably the biggest with the auto parts and so forth by far. But I'll tell you, there were many an occasion when one Senator Schumer was calling me as the U.S. ambassador, complaining about ultra-filtered milk and what it's doing to the dairy farmers in New York. And then I have Andrew Cuomo calling me, and we're talking about other issues. I'm telling you, it's not as easy a path to go to the states, to work through the states to get this accomplished as you may think, because there are issues within the states. And it was Senator Schumer who made it very clear to me, one Paul Ryan from the state of Wisconsin, who is very much aligned with him as it pertained to dairy. And I don't know if you noticed, but these two guys, regardless of the last few weeks and what's happened, these two guys are in very senior positions in Congress, and have a very particular view on Canada and very particular view on dairy. And so I also know, and I had met with a number of the industry representatives as well as a lot of meetings on USTR on lumber. So I know how the industry feels in the United States. I know how the industry feels in Canada as well, and I had those meetings. But this new U.S. administration is going to hear from lobbyists, from companies, from people who, are looking for a competitive advantage, and they think that this might be the path to giving them a U.S. domestic competitive advantage. So I'm not going to be here for your NAFTA meetings, but I'm telling you that this is going to be different than the negotiations that have happened previously, and the attitude of this new administration is approaching this in an asymmetrical way that, is going to leave your head scratching and hopefully not overly disappointed. But again, I think they're going to throw everything in the kitchen sink. You're going to have members of Congress getting lobbied by industries and companies who feel they're at disadvantage with Canada and think that this is their unique opportunity to get something done. And I just don't know Wilbur Ross well enough, but I watched him last night on television, and he went through and talked about taxation differences, and we're going to have to take care of that. And he talked about rules of origin differences, and we're going to have to deal with that. And the auto industry had specific parts that don't exist anymore, and he seems very articulate with regard to the auto industry, which is, outside of commodities, the largest component of trade between our two countries. And he seemed very attuned to the auto industry and very knowledgeable, and he's probably going to look at that as his number one focus, the way I'm reading him last night. So sorry, I jumped in here.
No, I want to add just before, I agree with what you're saying. The most important thing, though, is there's no political mileage in the U.S. in attacking Canada. None. There's that much goodwill. There are industries that will try to use this to their advantage, but there is no mileage, trust me, in attacking Canada, period. And I would have to think Donald Trump would understand that. That trip with Trudeau was a masterpiece, although Canada orchestrated it.
Minister Peterson, any
Well,
comment?
I think it's a rough road, and both the experts on Congress and what's happening here in the administration think it's going to be a tough road. This just means we have to double our efforts at taking the message to Americans that, first of all, we are fair traders. We're great partners to have on a trading relationship, and it's the biggest. It's worked so well in the past. In the 25 years, trade has more than tripled. But I think from Canada's point of view, it also shows, again, how we are in a precarious position when we're so dependent on one trading partner. And this, I think, is in doubling up on the U.S. deal, I think we've got to probably triple up on other deals that are out there. I'm very pleased that CETA went through, but when Trump got out of the TPP, Canada got sideswiped, and it means we do not have a deal in the offing with Japan, Malaysia, Vietnam. And are we going to be able, as a market of only 35 million people, to get these people to sit down at the table with us to do a bilateral? And I think we lost a lot when that TPP fell apart. And I noticed that Japan has not indicated that they have any great wish to sit down with us and renegotiate without the U.S. at that table, because that was the big prize for most of the 12 people in that deal. So we've got a lot of work to do, and opportunities.
Okay, thank you. We'll now move to questions from the audience. I will give priority to students asking questions.
Students.
But okay. Up there, please.
John Weeks. John.
My dinner
John's
part.
next on the list.
This will be short, and I think a short answer too. but I think it has to be asked. Michael Robinson from Toronto. I'm just a private lawyer. Listening to the panel and mindful of what Larry Herman wrote in the Globe and Mail a few weeks ago, very cogently, I'd like to hear the panel's reaction from a rather selfish Canadian point of view to the theory that it's time to abandon our Mexican neighbors and friends to their own devices, and they're going to have their own troubles, and do a bilateral, maybe quick and dirty, with the U.S. and trade on our goodwill that we've got now. The only people that are really going to get hurt are the Canadian auto parts manufacturers who've already set up in Mexico, but somebody's going to get sacrificed, and probably them as well as dairy if we went bilateral. But it sounded like a very neat way around these dilemmas we have.
Who would like to start?
Short-term gain, long-term loss.
I think it depends on what the U.S. does entirely on that issue, but Canada has always felt, as a small country and nation, that we are better off dealing on a multilateral basis in almost all areas than bilaterally with bigger, more powerful partners.
I'll try that one, Michael. You know, you mentioned that only the Canadian auto parts companies that have supply chain in Mexico will be hurt. I disagree with you. I think there's a lot more integration across the three countries than just the auto sector. You know, the aviation sector, which we are in, has both research facilities and manufacturing facilities in Mexico. So the supply chains are highly integrated. And as a number of persons have pointed out, a lot of the low margin businesses that are in Mexico are not going to come back to the United States. They're simply not profitable in a high wage economy. So I think we actually have in the business community an interest in maintaining a trilateral trading relationship. As far as the Canadian approach to Mexico is concerned, my view has always been that Canadians are schizophrenic about Mexico. They love it. They certainly love it in winter. On the other hand, they would throw it under the bus if their own interests are at stake. I just think people don't realize in Canada and the United States that their interests actually are in having an integrated Mexico. Just imagine a Mexico that is isolated, slips back down into poverty. If you think you have a problem with migration now, you will have a really big one later.
You know, Jim mentioned multilateralism. I view the Canadians as the quintessential multilateralists. I mean,
Thank you.
you love these multilateral organizations. I like them too, although a lot of Americans are suspicious of them. It's interesting. I was a governor of Michigan at the time of the free trade agreement with Canada. It went rather smoothly, although there was some criticism. Again, the lumber industry complained even at that time. But by the way, they've been complaining on both sides for a couple, it seems to me, a couple hundred years actually, but whatever, before Confederation. What's interesting is that when NAFTA started, it was really going to be a U.S.-Mexico free trade agreement. As John may recall, Canada asked to be part of it. Initially, you were not part of it. They asked to be and became part of it because of the belief in multilateralism, and they really didn't want to be left out. I don't blame you. It seems to me that the Trudeau administration and anyone in power in Canada is going to have to protect Canadian interests first and foremost, period. They will. On the other hand, throwing Mexico under the bus, Mike, won't just be harmful to the image of Canada as standing up for international understanding. I think it could be very damaging to Canada all over Latin America. They're watching how the U.S. and then eventually maybe Canada treats Mexico. And we are part of the Western Hemisphere. And that's something that we ought to think very carefully about. We Americans, as we proceed, we're having a hard enough time in the world with some of the rhetoric. So that's one piece that I don't think has been thought about yet. And I'm sure Justin Trudeau, this will weigh very heavily. He is not going to want to be doing things that look hostile to the Latin culture.
Just on Ross's thing about the degree of integration in the auto sector alone, Mexico now has 8 assemblers, 3 American, 1 German, and 4 Japanese. Magna has 24 plants in Mexico. Now, these are all in an integrated supply chain. Undoing that is going to be a problem. And this is where I think we go to the manufacturers themselves and get them to lobby.
All right, John Weeks is next on my list, then Dan.
Well, thank you. I must say I'm going to talk later, so I'm tempted to react to a lot of what's been said, but I won't. I will ask a question, partly because Ambassador Heyman has said he's leaving before the NAFTA panel. The question I'd like to ask is, after listening to what's been said so far, if, let's assume we reach an agreement on a new refurbished NAFTA, will Congress approve that? I mean, you've said a few moments ago, Jim, that you don't think Congress will approve any trade agreement. So could we be in a situation where we go through a negotiation that could be quite difficult? We have an outcome, and then Congress turns it down, and then where would that leave us? And sort of coupled with that, we've seen what happened on health care. Now we're sort of told, oh, well, tax change is a lot easier than health care reform, so presumably it'll go through Congress without any problem at all. Not. And then there's trade, and trade is not terribly easy either, because I think there'll be a lot of different views in Congress in terms of how to try to manage the NAFTA negotiations. Are we, and yet, so if Congress can't agree positively, then the president is still left with a lot of authorities that have been delegated to him over the years, including, from most analysts' perspective, the ability to unilaterally, without Congress, withdraw from NAFTA, put various duties in place on a temporary basis. So if you could just talk around these issues a little bit and give us a sense of how you see this unfolding from a political point of view. Thank you.
I'll start quickly, just because I like to talk. If you could get the United Auto Workers and the AFL-CIO to back a trade deal, I think it would have it'd have a decent chance. I would watch what Paul Ryan says, and I would watch what Congressman Sandra Levin says, who's my successor in Michigan, who did support the Caribbean deal, and he did support the Korean arrangement. So, and also WTO with China. But he's going to look at this very carefully, starting with the substance. But certainly he won't be unmindful of the politics. But those will be some bellwethers, and I think you're going to have some union support, because the combination of protectionism in Congress and isolationism and nativism is stronger than I've seen in my entire lifetime, period. I got elected to Congress in 1974, so I've been around.
I think the experience we just watched with healthcare demonstrates that things can fall apart in terms of a vote, and the work that you do may result in that. But I think Jim has explained that well, and that you'll need other constituencies to come in. In this particular case, by extension, you'll need Democrats. And, you're going to have to see what the tone is in the media as well, because you're running into several elections, 18 and 20, and if people think they're voting for, and it says NAFTA, and I think Jim's right, if NAFTA in and of itself came before Congress today, it would not be approved because of the attitudes about protectionism and trade. if new improved version of NAFTA is accepted, media, unions, and you'll need at least some Democrats, and those that are running for reelection will feel that they have the cover to be supportive of it and tell the story. And it just, again, depends on the approach that the president takes. I would say most Canadian negotiations are fairly extended, and I think maybe extending this one out to see how the political landscape goes before diving right into the water would maybe be the best thing. Unless, of course, he wants to do a quick deal, and the quick deal fits exactly what you're looking. That's fine. We're good. Then you'll grab it and run with it. But I'm just going to be really surprised, given all the language and vitriol that the president has used toward Mexico and the content even of what was released the last 24 hours, if they don't throw everything in but the kitchen sink, including the kitchen sink, and really challenge everybody to be in scramble mode here. But we'll see. I guess we'll see real soon, too.
Any of our other panelists want to weigh in? If not, I'll move to the next question from Dan.
I was actually just pointing at Michael Robinson, but I always have something to say. I just on this point, I'm sure the governor and Jim Peterson would agree, and others in government. It's never a great idea to tell the voter that they're wrong. If they think it's the NAFTA that caused them pain, then that's what caused them pain. And as a guy from northeastern Ohio, we appreciate that more than anybody. So my question is really twofold. One is, should we kind of look at ourselves? I won't say Canada, I'll say the Canada-U.S. community, that we've been, to borrow Ross's word, schizophrenic on our approach to Canada-U.S., and that we've been afraid of that word integrated for a really long time in terms of how we've talked about the relationship. I mean, there's an executive order that's coming out today that's going to put a dollar amount next to what supply chain costs, what softwood lumber costs, et cetera, and that's going to look at U.S. versus Canada instead of what the cost of what the actual value of those integrated supply chains are. But for 20 years, we've hesitated to really talk about integration, largely because of concerns on Canada that the Americans are coming and taking us over. Do we need to change that messaging a little bit? Is it a little too late now? And then just lastly, in particular for Ambassador Heyman and Governor Blanchard, do you think the traditional Canadian negotiating approach here will work, which is be more prepared than the Americans and squeeze out every last drop of blood that you can to get the best deal, is going to work with this administration?
Well, you've left them silent. What can I say?
Yeah. I don't think there are sensitivities around integration in Canada the way there might have been a generation ago. I think people recognize that Canada is a trading country and that we have benefited from having an integrated economy with the United States and to a lesser degree within the three NAFTA countries. So I don't think the sensitivity is there around integration in the way it might have been in the past. I think people are frightened that if the whole system that we've built over the past 30 years collapses and we revert to just WTO rules, there'll be a very painful transition. But in a kind of perverse way, it might actually, at some level, help Canada because we will be forced to diversify. And also, if the United States erects trade barriers globally, Canada will be a pretty good place to base manufacturing and to export globally as a free trader with links to Europe. Who knows what, they're having preliminary discussions with China right now around a free trade agreement. So it's not, there can be unintended consequences of protectionism in the United States. But I think the transition for Canada will be very, very painful. So that's why I think Canadians are realistic and not hung up on words like integration any longer.
I think the current government in Canada is certainly looking beyond our borders and beyond the United States. And this goes back to the wonderful report done by Dominic Barton and his task force on long-term growth. I think you're on that, aren't you? Yeah, Ross. But it is certainly looking out. How do we compete globally? And that ultimately is the touchstone for what consumers get. And so I agree that I don't think Canadians have a phobia against internationalism. In fact, I think we've done a good job of saying it's so important that we get more of it.
I'd say two things. First, I'm not one to make real recommendations to the Canadian government how they should negotiate with the United States. But that being said, in any negotiation, you'd want to see, let somebody else make a move first and see what's on the table and what they're asking. I don't think it's clear yet the full depth and breadth of what the Commerce Department and Ross and team, however deep this team will or won't be, what they're really asking. And I think that once they lay, the cards down on the table, then I think every party, Mexico, Canada, and will be able to then build a strategy and how to best react to that. Either, at just stay 40,000 foot before you get in there and see if you can reposition it, or look at each of the individual components and then start negotiating away. But I think you have to game it out and plan for various strategies as to what the U.S. will do. But I don't think it's clear yet how the U.S. is going to play this card. And, it may be that the heat keeps going politically on the Trump government, and they need a win really bad, which is what I talked about, that they continue to scale back their aspirations on this part of what they were looking for to get a victory on the, up. So if it was today, I said be prepared for the worst, but it may be over time that they just sit down and say, let's just get this one done and let's put a victory up, and this might be a good place. I think I'm glad you brought up Dominic Barton's work and the whole team. I think the larger issue, which we're not talking about, is the new economy and how everything is absolutely changing. And to fight to hang on to old manufacturing, first of all, I think the Trump government and the president in particular fighting for, saying that he's going to bring back old world jobs that actually don't exist today anymore. In fact, didn't exist some decades ago, but he's going to put you back in coal mines and bring back the manufacturing that was taken away by China and Mexico, and we're going to bring it back and put you back to work in your old jobs, it's just a lie. Okay, let's just put it that way. So the reality is we're faced with increasing automation and technological change, and it's happening at an ever fast rate. And the real question is, in the new economy for those of us in North America, where some of these manufacturing plants that we're all talking about and worried about in this NAFTA 2.0, they may not even be in existence in 5 years. So how do we think about an agreement that takes into account something that looks out generationally, that looks at a new paradigm in terms of how we are building and making things? And what does that look like? And, try to build that in. I'm not sure that's how the Trump government is thinking. But I know the Trudeau government, in its far-reaching thoughts through the budget, through innovation and creativity, through, expanding, broadband throughout the country, doing these kinds of things, are preparing for a new economy that is upon us now. And if we don't figure that out, the populism and the gap between rich and poor is going to get ever wider, and we're going to have other very significant political problems. And I think we're just at the beginning of that. So I think that's what we need to focus on. And I'm sad to see SAD, real capital letters, SAD and MAD, that we're not embracing that in the United States, which is I believe, the innovation country of the world.
What's interesting you mentioned about jobs and old industries, but back even 40 years ago, or no, be more accurate, at least 30 years ago, the largest consumer of robots was General Motors. And the largest industry consumer of robots was the auto industry. If you look at the loss of jobs in the auto industry, you could start out with competition from Japan was way beyond anything anyone has discussed. And then secondly, it was automation, robots. And third, certainly, it was bad management. And then maybe some of the trade stuff. It's hard to quantify. Some of you, that would really help, because there is this idea that it was all NAFTA, or now it would be TPP. By the way, I call TPP Trump Putin's poodle. But other than that, now on trade generally, when I was serving as ambassador, we did a lot of polling of attitudes. They were private polls. We didn't publish them, but it was interesting because the people in the United States thought that Canada and Mexico got the best of the deal of NAFTA. Canadians thought it was the U.S., and Mexico got the best of NAFTA. And the Mexicans knew that it was the U.S., the Uncle Sam bullies, and the Canadians that got the best of NAFTA. I don't know how. I wish we'll talk to John. Being a Canadian negotiator with the U.S. is almost an impossible position if it's a public negotiation, because no matter what you do, the Canadian public is going to claim that you knuckled under to the big Uncle Sam bully. There's just nothing to be gained by high-profile trade disputes with the U.S. if you're a negotiator. I used to say one of the differences between Americans and Canadians is Canadians are negotiators and Americans are deal makers. All right. We now have a president who fancies himself on being a great deal maker. So my thinking is that Canada should proceed along the negotiating track, because you guys love to do that anyway. I'm telling you, litigation is our national sport. Yours is negotiation. So anyway, you're going to negotiate, and your people are going to enjoy it. They're going to be in heaven negotiating. All right, but somebody needs to go through the back channel to Donald Trump himself and come up with a deal. Aside from all the negotiations, I would say put together a framework, sell it to President Trump, and have him issue an edict. Here's the framework, now make it happen. And then they can worry about fitting the details into it. But I think a back channel, a deal maker with the president who wrote the book, The Art of the Deal, is the way to go. It all has to be back channel and private. No public discussion of it.
Could I just add to what Bruce talked about old industries? And by the way, your speech last night was terrific. And it's great to work with you. There's a recent study in Canada that shows that for every job lost to trade, there are 8 lost to innovation and new technologies. An example of that is CSL, or the Great Lakes ships. 20 years ago, they had a crew of 23. Now it's 5 doing the same work with machinery. So let's get with it.
I'm going to ask one last question. I ask the panelists to be concise in their answers. Each of you has been successful in more than one career, and we have a number of students in the audience. Do you have advice, insights you wish to pass on that you think would be helpful? And maybe I'll start with Ambassador Heyman.
New careers today are very different from old guys like me, where I spent 33 years in one job and then made a change. People are in the change mode, and it is not only accepted, it's expected that you spend just shorter periods of time doing multiple things. So adaptability to change, the unexpected, number one. Number two, network like crazy, because you need to have a much more expansive network than ever before, and do what you love, because if you love what you do, you'll do really well in your career and you'll be really happy.
Don't do what I've done it in many areas, and one of those, which I can tell you about, is don't be an idiot when it comes to the new technologies such as iPads and computers and all that sort of stuff.
I like the network. I would add, though, network face-to-face. This idea of having everything be email, Facebook, electronic, I think is a mistake. Networking face-to-face. For those of you who are interested in a political career, I would say find some people running for office that you think are really good and go help them. I learned so much helping other people running for office before I ever ran. And I started doing that at a very, very young age. But find some people that you really like, that you really believe in. It could be the school board, it could be state legislature, Congress, and help them. You'll learn a lot. Don't expect to get paid right away either. That's unrealistic. Read all the history you can get your hands on. And I think, certainly in today's world, learn languages, probably Spanish and French, but learn languages. If there's one thing that I wish I'd done more of was continue my French out of high school into college. I didn't, and I wish I had, but I think that's important.
And
Okay, well, I think it's really important for people to get international experience today. And if you look at the statistics, Canadians, kids, are just as bad as Americans in getting international experience. They like to stay home close to mama. And you've got to go and work abroad, live abroad, get that international experience under your belt, because companies are looking for people who are mobile and who have that international experience, because we operate on a global basis, and we don't want people just to be hired and stay in one place. So get out there.
All right, and I'll just wrap it up with advice to get engaged. Don't just sit back, get engaged. I'd like to, if you could please join me in thanking the panel. I think they did a fantastic job.
Thank you all. Thank you, Consul General, for chairing this great panel. We'll take a 10-minute break. Coffee and refreshments are out in the hallway.